This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence, and in today's special bonus episode, we bridge the gap between team coaching and a new coaching tools series hosted by Claudia Day, which begins next week. I have with me today Dr Richard Hale, somebody who's been working in the field of learning and development for the past 30 years. And today we're going to be talking about action learning. So, Richard, let's begin there. Tell me about what action learning is and perhaps a little bit more about your own background.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for the invitation to the podcast. I've worked in learning and development for the last 30 years and started off in a GEC Marconi, very much a structured approach to training and development that we had, with a big organizational structure, several businesses within it, and we cranked out a lot of training. We did a lot of training delivery. And the challenge was always, how do you ensure that the training that you deliver has an impact in terms of change in behavior? So application of skills, application of knowledge, and changes in behavior that are sustainable. Over time, I became more and more intrigued by the concept and philosophy of action learning, which has been, in many ways, it's a simple to describe approach whereby you get groups of people together to learn with and from each other, rather than always from the teaching of a trainer in a classroom, by working on real business problems and real challenges. It's more sophisticated than that, but it is, simple in terms of its concept. And it was developed as an approach by somebody I'd like to talk a little bit about, Professor Reg Revans, a very interesting character. But I got involved in looking at how we could use action learning alongside coaching and mentoring as a method to develop people and to develop business at the same time. So I, over my career, have become increasingly interested in organization development and how learning and development connects with OD, rather than is seen as a sort of separate activity or adjunct, within the sort of HR profession. So, I've made it my kind of role really over the last sort of 20 years to develop methods of action learning which have been proven to work in the private sector, some of the big banks, and also in the public sector with a number of government departments and ministries in the civil service, etc.
That's great. You mentioned Revans there. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, an interesting character, Professor Reg Revans, born 1907, died in 2003, so had a long life and career, and a very much a polymath, really. So he started out as a scientist in physics, a research physicist, working and researching in the Cavendish laboratories in Cambridge, working under the likes of Rutherford. So the leading lights of the day who were working on some of the major world challenges in science. 5 Nobel Prize winning scientists were in that department at the time. And he was clearly a good learner himself in observing how the laboratory was successful and how it was led by people like Rutherford. And what he noticed was that the power and the strength and the breakthroughs that came scientifically came not so much from people showing off with their sort of big ego about their scientific achievements, but by what he called sort of working with their ignorance. And he noticed that it was use of questioning and a probing and insightful approach to questioning that often led to breakthroughs in terms of learning. And he kind of took all of this learning himself and eventually changed career, really. He went into what we would now call OD, or organisation development. He was the director of education in the coal mines when the coal industry was trying to rebuild itself after the war. He worked in the hospital sector. He worked outside of the UK Did a lot of work in the higher education sector and industry in Belgium, for instance. So, he went from this scientific kind of base to working with industry, with hospitals, etc. And he took his learning from his background in science, and particularly from the Cavendish, as he described it, where people like Einstein used to sort of pop into the laboratory and say things like, if you think you understand the problem, make sure you're not deceiving yourself. So great sort of quotations. But he saw all this and thought, how can I apply my learning about learning to an organizational sector and organizational challenges? When organizations were dealing with the challenges of the nation, really, or of the world, at the time. And I worked with a number of people through an Action Learning Institute who had worked with Revans and who had learned from him the methods of action learning, and that sort of led me into developing a method of making action learning work in practice, which I've called action learning questions. So it's just one approach to action learning. It's not the only approach, but it's my approach, if you like, that has been applied with a number of partner organizations. There's an organization called Maven in the world of organization development who've adapted this for work-based learning, linked to developing organization development capability, as an example. I've used it in care home groups, in all sorts of different types of organization. What I realized was that if you studied Revans and what he wrote and said about action learning, there was basically a philosophy behind it that was proven, and he has various formulae that he's developed. One of the most famous is the idea that L equals P plus Q. So L for learning equals a combination of programmed knowledge or programmed instruction, what we might call sort of teaching, the knowledge that you can get from books. It's pre-existing knowledge, and Q, which is questioning. So L equals P plus Q. Learning comes from programmed knowledge and questioning. And he encouraged us to focus more on the questioning than glorifying, if you like, the programmed knowledge. And very relevant today, he recognized that if the rate of change that we're experiencing exceeds existing knowledge, then you don't need a training course. That's not going to help, which people are using to learn from the book or from the guru. That you actually need action learning. So you need to bring people together, often from different functions and different disciplines, to communicate and challenge each other, to leave their ego at the door, as he learnt from the Cavendish, and to work as, he talked about comrades in adversity. So coming together, facing the real challenges. And, goodness knows we've been through a few of those, in the world and nationally over the last couple of years with the global pandemic. So in my view, this is what I've been working on for the last 30 years myself, 20 years, particularly in terms of action learning. And, I believe that the time is right for more of it. And we've got proven ways of doing it. So an interesting character, Reg Revans, he's often sort of, he's been sort of lauded as the, if you like, the founding father of action learning. And he clearly was. But at the time, he was working, counter to the culture. So the business schools were emerging. He was, appointed as a professor in University of Manchester, and he had a kind of an on-off relationship with the academic world, because in a sense he was academic, but in another sense he was suggesting that we shouldn't be over glorifying the gurus from the academic world, and often what he called the sort of self-appointed experts, who we would sit at their feet and sort of listen to every word they say, write it down, and assume this is, how we solve the problems of the world or of our business. Interesting. And as an aside, he was also an Olympic long jumper. So he competed in the 1928 long jump for Great Britain.
That's a really useful insight as to what action learning is. Perhaps we can talk a bit about the relevance of action learning and why it's important in the world today.
Well, extremely relevant. If I look at my experience of the last sort of few years as we approached the global pandemic, even before that, organizations were experiencing an increasingly rapid rate of change. We're into what is sometimes described as the second industrial revolution now, with the crossover of disciplines between different sort of professions, artificial intelligence, etc. All of this was happening before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. And my sort of observation, I guess, of what I saw happening was a lot of panic, a lot of recognition that we don't actually have the answers. The top scientists in the world didn't have the answers. They didn't have the vaccines. They didn't know how to manage social distancing, etc. We had to work it all out on the hoof whilst trying to cope as best we could. And yet we were kind of locked into with, I guess, media sometimes reflecting the clamour from the public to have sort of specific answers. If you look at how questions were being posed at the time to experts or to politicians, they were kind of closed questions. When will we have the vaccine? When will the numbers drop? These were kind of expecting that somebody knew the answer and just needed to tell the world, and it wasn't like that. The top scientists didn't know the answers to these questions. They were having to work it out. The top politicians didn't know the answers. And eventually I noticed that, partway through this period, one or two people in the public eye started to admit, I don't know, you're asking me questions I don't know the answer to. And actually, we noticed people starting to work with their not knowing. And that's action learning. Action learning is about working with not knowing, working with our ignorance. Back to Relevance and what he said about Rutherford and the Cavendish laboratories, that it was working with and trading their ignorance that led to breakthroughs. And I think that's what happened with the breakthroughs in terms of the pandemic. It was when the scientists started talking closely with the social scientists, because you can do your science, but you've also got to get your sort of science accepted and working in practice with organizations and complex political structures. So, the scientists, the social scientists, the academics, the media, etc., and internationally and globally as well, collaborating and learning and piloting, through in different sort of regions and areas and specific areas, learning from that and then spreading the learning on a wider basis. Now, it wasn't called action learning. There wasn't a kind of decision to use an action learning approach. But what I noticed, I guess, is that it was that action learning philosophy and thinking that has led to a number of the breakthroughs. I was working at the time with one organization, which was a care homes group. And their big question, if you like, because I think with action learning, it's good to start with one of the big organizational questions. Their big question really was, how can we comply with legislation? How can we keep the families safe, who are in our care, and increase the opportunities for families to see their relatives in care homes? That was the big challenge that they had. Nobody had the one sort of answer to that. They had to work it through as a team. They had to collaborate. They had to work across disciplines, and they came up with a solution. Now we're in a phase post-pandemic where the questions are different types of question. So questions like, how do we make hybrid working work? That's a big question a lot of organizations are wrestling with. How do we care for the mental health of our people? Another big question that I think is highly relevant, as a lot of people are experiencing post-traumatic stress following the pandemic. How do we build trust or rebuild trust after we've been through industrial disputes? These are the high level questions. And I think that these are the starting points, beneath which, if you're in a specific organization, profession, or sector, you can then sort of articulate and work out what are the questions we need to be addressing, in our bank or in our government department, or in our care home group. So questioning is the key when we don't know the answers and we don't know the solutions. Despite the fact, as Revan said, there are always self-appointed experts who, will, imply that or suggest that they do know the answers. But if you start to probe and question the thinking behind their ideas, they don't always stand up. And actually, rather than looking to the experts constantly for the answers to everything, sometimes it's appropriate to bring people together in groups, in what is called an action learning set or an action learning group, to collaborate, communicate with each other, ask insightful questions, which eventually will lead to new knowledge and to learning at an individual level and at a team level and at an organizational level.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's a really interesting insight as to how action learning is different from other approaches in both the personal and professional development communities and industries there. I'm curious, have you got any examples of how action learning is applied? How does it actually work in practice?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there are kind of different approaches you can take. I mean, you can, for instance, take one of those questions, such as the examples I gave earlier. How do we make hybrid working work, for instance? And you could say that is one of the organizational team questions that we need to address. Rather than assuming that, the hierarchy, has got the answers and that the boss should know how to make hybrid working work, let's put it to the people in the team to explore this and discuss it. So in this example, you have one specific question that you want to investigate and explore collaboratively. Now, individuals might work on different aspects of it. So one might look at how do we deal with the legislation associated with the employment of people on a hybrid basis. Somebody else might look at the psychology of, how do we manage the well-being of people who are working on a hybrid basis. And people would work on different aspects of the same question and come together in a learning set to, one, first of all, understand the question better. So that's where you would start, by interrogating and exploring the question, not jumping to solutions and, assuming that we can come up with one answer. And these are working on what are defined as problems or challenges rather than puzzles. So a puzzle might be, how do we get social distancing to work within a confined space, or how do we actually reconcile the accounts on a spreadsheet, where there is a known method that you can use, and it's not necessarily easy, but there is a method that you can follow, and there is existing knowledge as to how to solve those sort of puzzles. What we're concerned with action learning is what we would define as problems or challenges, and in fact I would define them as questions, because I think that's more positive than defining them as a problem. So they're questions that are explored rather than answered. They're not necessarily, one answer to these questions. Hybrid working, there's not one answer to that. It's multifaceted. So that's one method that you can use, which is you bring people together who have some skin in the game. They have some interest in tackling this challenge. They may be, having to work in a hybrid way themselves. They may be having to manage people who are working in a hybrid way, and they've not done it before. So they have some interest in this, and they're going to be able to contribute to investigating the question first of all. That might take a few weeks to do. It might mean going, out beyond the group and investigating and doing some research, finding out how other organizations do it, referring to what I would call the sky in my metaphor of sky, ground, and underground. So they might go to the sky, which would be the theory, the models, the white papers, information on LinkedIn, talking to other organizations, neighbors, competitors, for instance, and gathering data gathering data maybe from the ground as well, the ground being within their own business, talking to people about how hybrid working is, going for them, and gathering data, surveying people, etc. And not to forget the importance of gathering data from underground. And this is kind of organization development type thinking, really, systemic thinking, that we're not working with data only that is visible, but also we're working with sometimes data that's really important, but it's less visible and it's underground. So it's the politics, it's the values, it's how people feel, and what do people really think compared to what they actually say. And, in an OD way, really trying to bring that sort of data to the surface, to the ground, comparing it with, the data that you've got from the ground and the sky, and making sense of all this. And I've captured all of this in a specific method, actually, over the last 20 years, which has become quite popular, called knowledge mapping. So you create a map collaboratively of the knowledge related to our question, and then you decide what you're going to do about it. Because in action learning, there's no learning without action. There's no action, without learning. So, as a facilitator of action learning, often what I'm encouraging people to do at the end of their meetings is to say, declare what are they going to do next? What are they actually going to do? Which is different to, if you like, traditional training, where you might ask that question at the end of a training course, but you don't necessarily bring people back together to find out what they did do and what are the consequences of what they did and what have they learned from it. And that's at the heart of action learning is, you're investigating a question, you're doing some research, you're taking some informed action, and then you're finding out what the results of that have been and capturing that. And your learning is happening close to the action. It's not happening in a remote way in a university or in a in an ivory tower. It's actually happening close to where the real work is taking place. If that's the hospital, it's at the bedside. It's in the wards or in the emergency department. In a bank, it might be in the branches or the branch networks, etc. So, there are different ways of doing it. What I've described there is, the first method, really, which is common problem, and we all tackle different aspects of that common challenge. The other method is one where we might all bring our own individual questions, which would be different to a learning set. We would say, look, my real challenge at the moment, the big question that I would describe as a sort of how can I type question. So how can I develop my influencing skills, so that I can support my client more effectively, for instance, is a personal question, but it has a business context. And I've, over the last 20 years, developed the method called action learning questions, where people can do this in quite a formal way. So they bring their question, they articulate their question, they get help from the learning set in articulating that question and capturing it, and then they go through a structured process, similar to what I described previously, but quite structured. It's you consult with stakeholders who have an interest in you succeeding by tackling your action learning question, and you write up an account or present an account of your learning at the end of it. And over the years, we've had this approach accredited by various universities and business schools around the world, actually, who have recognized that this is an alternative approach to work-based learning, which is, yes, quite different to classroom-based teaching, but certainly has a valuable place when it comes to helping organizations to become learning organizations, really. But those are the two types of action learning.
Yeah, they're useful and insightful examples there. Thanks, Richard. I think with that in mind, just drilling into a little bit more of what you were saying there about perhaps the core principles, perhaps we could go into those a little bit more, the core principles that are at play here in regards to action learning.
I guess there are kind of principles and then there are methods, really, and it's perhaps important to slightly differentiate. I mean, principles I've talked about to some extent in terms of the relevance principles of, there's a principle of a democratic approach to learning, in fact, that whilst we do respect people's expertise, we also are open to learning from everybody, with and from each other. And we don't dismiss people just because, for instance, they're not a subject matter expert in my subject or my profession, and say, well, what can they tell me about, whatever my profession is, IT or HR or whatever, because they're not from that background. It's actually to be open to the idea that I may learn something, from their insightful questioning that they ask of me. So that's a democratic principle that is behind action learning. Giving people airtime is related to that as well. So the idea that if you bring people together as a learning set, each person should have the right to have their own airtime or to make a claim for their own airtime. Airtime means time spent talking about my problem or my issue, focused just on me. So giving people an opportunity to have airtime, is important. And then there are kind of various skills which you'll recognize as very relevant to coaching and mentoring. So asking good questions, being a good listener, reflecting back, etc. So these are some of the skills which, I don't think it's a case of, in the world of learning and development, that we have to say, I favor action learning over and above coaching. I see coaching and mentoring and action learning as all methods of developing people, which have certain overlaps. Certainly there are particular skills that bridge across all three of those methods. So, yeah, and there are kind of specific techniques you might use when you're running an action learning set. I would encourage people to use a checking in process at the beginning. It works well. So you ask people or you invite people to say, how are they showing up? How are they feeling at the time of attending the meeting? What's going on in the here and now for them? What's distracting them, etc. So to get that out in the open and to enable you then to hit the ground running in working on the issues that they're bringing to the program. I think there's a principle around you need to contribute. You're giving and you're receiving. So you're giving your own questioning to others. You're trying to support and help others with their learning. And, yes, you'll be receiving support and help yourself. So there's a principle of reciprocity, I would say, there.
It really does. And I think that leads me to ask you more about the learning set experience and to learn more about that. What happens in a learning set meeting?
Yeah. So, I guess people turn up and you agree contractually. Hopefully, if you've formed a learning set, you've been through a kind of psychological contracting approach of, agreeing how often are we going to meet, where are we going to meet, how are we going to meet, are we going to meet virtually as well as in person, etc. You would typically, have people arrive and if you do a check-in well, everybody would have a chance to, center themselves and say, where their thinking is at and where their emotions are at currently. You would then agree maybe a timetable. So you might say, we've got 2 hours and it might be a 2-hour set meeting. It might be a full day set meeting where people have longer. They have an hour on their own issue. Typically a learning set would be, 5 to 7 or 8 people, to give enough opportunity for everybody to have airtime. If it gets much bigger than that, you're probably going to need to split it into, two groups. And you might have somebody as the facilitator. Reg Evans, interestingly, was quite critical of the idea of, people as making a profession out of being a facilitator of action learning, albeit, he recognized that the process needed to be facilitated effectively. And often it was useful to have a facilitator at the start in the early stages for maybe the first few meetings of a learning group. But certainly the learning sets I work with quite a lot at the moment in government departments through my work with Maven. we encourage people to, take time to bring their own issue, to support each other, to agree what are they actually going to do, to reflect on their personal learning. And what you find is a great dynamic happens because people learn from each other's problems. So I go into it maybe thinking, oh, I'm unique, my problems are unique. And actually you find out that other people are facing similar challenges, and you learn from hearing and supporting them with their airtime. So there's an interesting social psychology dynamic that occurs there. The other thing which is interesting and often occurs is you notice parallel processes. So the issues that you're trying to work on out there, if you like, in the business or in your own job, which you bring to the learning set, actually start to show themselves in the learning set as well. So if I have maybe I have a challenge around my imposter syndrome or something like that I want to work on out there in the business or with my seniors, and I come to the learning set and I start to experience some of that in the learning set. Ideally, you'd have such a degree of trust built up in the learning set that you'll be encouraged to recognize the parallels between what is occurring in real time in the here and now that reflects what you're working on and want to work on out there in the there and then. So you kind of eventually, as a facilitator of action learning, you become attuned to noticing these things and being able to support other people. What I think that the role of the facilitator in action learning is really about is to enable the learning set to become independent of you. It's not about creating a dependency. That's something that sometimes people misunderstand and think, well, I have to position myself as the expert because I'm needed as the facilitator. No, your aim is to actually make yourself redundant, to encourage people within the learning set, participants in the learning set, to actually become facilitators. They might say, well, we're used to this process now, so I will help with the facilitation of the timekeeping today and today's session, etc. And eventually the learning set self-moderates, manages itself effectively. And quite often the programs where I've used action learning for a fixed period of time, what we then realize is that the set continues meeting after the formal time is completed. So they completed their course or their program within the organization, and they continue to meet, sometimes for years. I'm part of the learning set myself, which started about 7 or 8 years ago. And we were initially set up for a program that lasted about 6 months, but we've kept meeting.
Perhaps we could talk about some of the challenges of making it work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess what I noticed when I first got involved in action learning, and I was learning myself about the history of it, was that there were a lot of people who were quite sort of evangelistic about the principles and relevance and all of that. And that didn't necessarily serve them well when it came to getting action learning to work in practice, in a practical way, in a corporate sort of environment. And you needed to actually connect action learning to the organizational systems, whether those are the performance management systems or the coaching processes. It needed to be integrated with other systems. That's a challenge. And I think for me, it means that when we talk about a facilitator of action learning, I designed an action learning facilitator accreditation process. And in order to design it, I looked back at what Revan said about action learning, and he talked about 3 roles. And I've changed the names of these roles a bit, but they're valid and important roles. And they're not all about what goes on in the learning set. To me, that's the easy bit. If you're a good coach or you're a good mentor, you can probably pick up how to be a facilitator of learning sets quite easily with some training and support. The real challenges are, how do you actually get action learning to be accepted as a method of learning and development in organizations which are increasingly full of experts in different disciplines or new professions that are emerging in organizations, who might actually sort of be a little bit cynical about, well, hang on, this is a process where you just bring people together and they ask questions of each other and then you solve the problem and everybody's learned. And, is it kind of, is it like a group hug? Is it a kind of about just being happy and supportive? No, it's not. It's actually about being really challenging of each other. But the first challenge is getting permission, if you like, and support and advocacy for action learning to be introduced into an organization. You might even not call it action learning. You might call it something else because the language of the business, suggests that something else might be more acceptable. But the principle is key, is that you need to get support from the very top if you can. It's, the most successful programs I've been involved with, they've had very high level support. It might be the MD of the division of the bank, or it might be the chief people officer, in a government organization. But they've supported the idea, they're behind it, they believe in it, and they're backing you to then get it set up. And what I would typically then do is form a learning, a steering group. A steering group which includes the supporters of this approach, a number of senior people, and actually the cynics. So the people who might be sort of critical about it, bring them inside the tent, get them on the steering group. I did it with one bank a few years ago, and there was a program project manager, a very senior guy, who was a bit sort of skeptical about the whole idea. And we were introducing action learning linked to a master's program there for senior and middle level leaders, one of the big UK banks. And we knew that this guy needed to be brought into the senior team. In fact, the MD even suggested it, into the steering group, just met quarterly and oversaw what was going on. And we included on that steering group participants from the program. Actually, we had 2 participants who were elected by the program participants themselves, and they elected 2 participants to join the steering group, and they rotated it. So they had a real voice at the top table in terms of how the program was being rolled out, how it was being adapted, how it's being received, feeding back, etc. So for me, I call that the role of the mobilizer of action learning. So that's wearing the hat of the person who's going to try and get this going. In the example of the client that I was just telling you about, I was partly the mobilizer, but I was from outside, working in a bought-in contracting role. But the mobilizer, I can think inside, was a guy who was the chief of training and learning and development. And they were very strong in being able to oil the wheels within the organization to get it accepted and embedded. So mobilize is a key role. Then you have the role of the set advisor, so the person who's running or facilitating the learning set, which I've talked about. And then you have a kind of learning catalyst. So this role of somebody who action learning's happening, but you're taking a holistic approach to it rather than saying this is a training course. This is something that's happening sort of in a discrete and separate way. As a catalyst of learning, they're spotting the opportunities to connect learning from the programs or from the learning sets with learning that's happening in other parts of the business or organization. They're able to spread the learning, if you like, and aim towards creating a learning organization. 3 modes, if you like, of facilitation of action learning: the mobilizer, the set facilitator, and the learning catalyst.
Yeah, that's great. So we've talked about the challenges and we've talked about some of the facilitation there. Is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of making action learning work?
Any organization thinking about it needs to make a few decisions as to how are you going to introduce it. So do you want to work on specific, there needs to be an big organizational challenge, whether it's a burning platform or whether it's a great opportunity that you identify. And it's something where we don't know the answers. So standard project management, if you like, or standard training courses are not actually going to deliver the solution to this. So ask yourself the question, are we dealing with multifaceted, complex problems which could be defined as challenges, which could be defined as questions? And do we have an energy from people who would be interested in coming together to work on those alongside business as usual as well? So they need to find time to do this and to prioritize it alongside business as usual. And how can we then all become learners at a personal level, but also contributing to organizational change and organizational learning? So where it's used in a very structured way with action learning questions, what we do is have people write a paper at the end of their program. Typically, it's a 3,000 word paper because it's accredited at postgrad level. And they have to reflect on, one, what was their question? How did they develop it? Two, how did they investigate that question? So did they do some research and what was their experience of that? How did they work as an action learner with other action learners? And what have they learned? What have they learned about themselves? What have they learned about the problem or the challenge? What have they learned about their organization? And for me, the power of this is that it's addressing learning at the level of insights, which is a level beyond simply acquiring new knowledge or applying new knowledge in terms of skills. Those are still important things to do. But with action learning, you have an opportunity, because you're doing it over a period of time, to learn at the level of insights. Now, my research doctorate 22 years ago was on the subject of learning through mentoring, learning relationships, coaching and mentoring relationships. And my mentor, supervisor for that program and research, was a guy some people may have heard of called Alan Mumford, Professor Alan Mumford, who, alongside Peter Honey, created the learning styles preferences questionnaire and survey. So Alan Mumford, when I was talking to him about my interest in action learning and in mentoring, said, don't preoccupy yourself with the knowledge and the skills aspects of learning. Focus in on learning at the level of insights. And you can read his stuff on this. He talks about it, and I've written about it as well, that this is the most powerful level of learning, particularly in the field of management and leadership, in my view. It's what are the insights that I've gained into why I work effectively in this sort of environment or with this sort of boss, or I don't work so effectively here. That's to do with my self-insight and knowledge about myself, which I may have gained through action learning, or it might be insights into the way that the organization works that I've achieved, through an action learning program. The interesting thing about learning at that level of insights is you can't predict at the start of the program what insights I'm going to have learned by the end. You have to have faith in the process and trust it's going to work. There will be some insights. And my insights at the end of the program or process will be different to yours. Let's accept that diversity and individuality and embrace it. And for me, that's what I've been sort of driven by myself, is one of the key principles of learning, particularly in the management and leadership context. It's about how do we learn at the level of insights. And a lot of accepted experts in the field of leadership, or some, have recognized that you can't teach leadership. In fact, it's about what is learned more than what is taught. Henry Mintzberg has for some time, suggested to us that you can't really teach leadership in a typical, Harvard sort of case study way that effectively, that in fact leadership is learned, and he recognizes the value of an action learning approach.
So to wrap up then, Richard, on that theme of insights there, 30 years in the learning and development space, what have you learned?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, a whole lot of stuff. And I try to practice what I preach, in that over the years, I've written up, lots of accounts of my learning. Typically over any sort of year, what I try to do is publish with not hundreds of papers, but publish one or two papers which capture my own personal learning, and to link that into my practice. So, For me, I guess what I've realized is that what I thought, I had a hunch that this approach called action learning might have legs that would continue, beyond the year 2000 when I got very interested in it, has proven to be the case. And that we still face organizationally and globally a lot of complex problems and not just puzzles, but complex problems and challenges, and that action learning is still a great way to tackle them. But I'd encourage anybody who wants to find out more. Obviously, have a look at on my website, nocanwilldo.com. There's a page with all of the publications and articles that people can just download, and feel free to use them, and let's discuss and talk about it.
That's great. Well, that's been a fascinating conversation and a really interesting and insightful introduction to action learning, Richard. You mentioned the website there. Where else can our listener connect with you to learn more?
Come and see me on LinkedIn. I have a page there, and just link up and join up, and feel free to, if you've been interested in what we're talking about, or you've got your own experiences of action learning that you'd like to share, do share, and LinkedIn is quite a good place to do that. I'm also involved in the development of facilitators of action learning. So if you're interested in, your own development in facilitating action learning, feel free to make contact, and I can talk about that. But thank you for Rob, for the insightful questions that you've asked me, because they've provoked me into discussing things that I hadn't necessarily pre-prepared, but you've managed to draw those out through good questioning yourself.
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you for today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. I'm Rob Lawrence. For 20 years, the AC's purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations, and societies worldwide. To find out more about the Association for Coaching and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or explore our website at associationforcoaching.com. You can keep up to date with our latest podcast episodes, enjoy the wealth of digital learning offerings, and gain insights from our Coaching Perspectives magazine.